Hello, welcome to Tub Talks on location in Washington, D.C. Welcome to Tub Talks with Damon. I am so happy to be here today with my friend, Washington, D.C. resident, Daniel Moberg. Thank you for visiting my tub, the tub, a tub. It's so good to see you.
Thank you for having me, Damon. Really
I'm so glad you're here. So first thing that I'm talking to and asking all my guests is what you like most about your body.
Well, that is actually a big question, and I think part of the reason why I was appreciative of an opportunity to come hang out with you this afternoon, which is as a person who lives with a physical disability, thinking about parts of my body that I actually like and have an automatically positive relationship has been a journey for me over the course of my life. So
let's talk about that
definitely
journey.
have an answer. I definitely could come up with something, but it's been a journey for sure.
Well, let's think about the journey. Then I want to come back to that question because I do want you to answer that. But you mentioned living with a disability. What is the name of the disability that you live with?
Yes, I live with cerebral palsy.
And at what age was that diagnosed?
So not too long after I was born, there was maybe a couple of years. So maybe like between 1 and 2, there was a period of time where my parents were trying to figure it out with my doctors in terms of my physical development and like physical movement, so crawling and that kind of thing. Like those milestones were just happening differently. And so finally, between the age of 1 and 2 is when they figured out, like, okay, birth injury that ultimately resulted in cerebral palsy.
And how were your parents with that?
Well, it's interesting. I appreciate the question. I don't think I've had like too many conversations specifically with my parents about their experience of being in a situation where their firstborn is going to have these physical challenges. So I'd actually like to ask them at some point, right? Like, what was your experience?
See, so many things get opened in the tub, so that's why I love having these conversations.
But what I do remember is just how closely they worked with me, right? I mean, I was going to different kinds of therapy from a very early age, right? Experiencing surgeries and things to help sort of alleviate some of the ways that CP physically manifests for me, right? So there were some corrective surgeries, and then always like physical and occupational therapy. And there were just years of that until I was 13, 14 years old, where my mother in particular was driving me back and forth between our home in Los Angeles to Children's Hospital, and 4 days a week I was in some kind of like after school, after care, like therapy situation. So when I think about what it was like for them, I in this moment I think about like that was a lot of work, right? A huge commitment that they were going to make, because I know my parents have always been unambiguous as far as how much they love and care for me, and I don't have any siblings.
Good.
So it is just me and my parents, right? In terms of my immediate family. But I definitely think about just how much work and how much of a commitment it was for them, particularly in my early years.
And how about for you, growing up, being in school, and having these after-school therapy appointments? What do you remember about that? What did that feel like?
It's funny because it's like, it was my life. Like it was and is my life. So it's not like I could compare it. I had no other experience for myself to compare it. But I do remember like just sort of this generalized frustration that I often had. Like, oh, I have to go do this thing again. Oh, we're doing this thing again. It's physically uncomfortable. These people are going to stretch me and do this and that. And like, it was a physical and mental commitment. And at some point an imposition, right? Like, I'm a preteen, I'm a teenager. This is an imposition on my life now, right? Like, it's not just something I'm doing, but it's something that I feel like is gets in my way, right? As a person growing up.
Well, now, for those who don't know,
Mhm.
what is cerebral palsy?
Yeah, that's a good question. So CP happens on a spectrum for folks, and it is a neuromuscular condition. So my brain is telling the muscles in my body, particularly my like lower extremities, legs and feet, to just my legs and feet are working really hard all the time. They are right. So it's about like decreased range of motion and just tight muscles because my brain is telling my even right now that like they're working right and they're working hard. So and the reason I say it's on a spectrum is like I recognize I am fortunate in terms of my own experience in comparison to some other folks with CP because like some folks with CP don't have use of their legs or feet, right? So folks use mobility devices or wheelchairs. Some folks with CP don't have speech. Some folks with CP have like other cognitive manifestations of their CP. So it's just like a whole range of experiences.
Wow.
Yeah.
So when did you start to realize that you had feelings for men or that you were gay or had erotic desires for men?
Pretty early on. I think I would say like around the time I was 7 or 8 years old.
Okay. So what was that like? You know, I think a lot of us, especially when we were younger, can kind of remember those moments when we realized we were different in some way. What was that like for you, already living with a disability, to realize that you were also different in the sexual way?
Yeah. As I think about it now, it was like this sense that I had that like, oh, here's another thing, right? Here is something else that is going to count against me in my life, right? So it's like interesting to like remember, noticing like, oh, I think and feel differently towards like the men and boys in my life than I do about the girls and women. But just almost having the next immediate thought be, oh no, okay, so I have this experience as with living with my CP, and now here I am, like I don't think I'm straight, I'm gonna like, what does it mean for me to like be on a coming out journey? So it was just sort of this other thing that I kind of like, that before I really began my coming out journey was just this other thing that I kind of dreaded, like living with and navigating.
And was there anyone you could talk to about this at that time or share these feelings with?
I remember I grew up in a neighborhood with lots of kids who were my own age. So at the time, my next door neighbor, like folks who literally live right next door, I consider the two of them two sisters, like two of my best friends. And so at the beginning of my coming out journey, I was like 14, 15 years old. And I just, they were the first two people I ever said the words, like, I think I'm gay. And
how old were you then?
About 14, 15.
Wow, okay.
Yeah.
And how was that received?
In the sort of awkward, like, early teenage way of like, okay, it was a warm reception, but it was like an awkward, like, what do we do with this as kids kind of like moment.
What did that feel like for you?
I knew that they still wanted to be my friends, and I knew that I wasn't going to lose their friendship, but it left those initial moments left me feeling a little bit lonely. Like, oh, what is this actually going to be like to continue to have these conversations with people I love? So I definitely remember feeling some loneliness there, for sure.
Wow. When did you start to socialize or go to spaces that were kind of gay or queer spaces?
That would have to have been in my undergrad, seeking out and joining the Queer Straight Alliance on campus. And actually, now that I'm thinking about it, I was in the Boy Scouts, and so I met a couple of friends in the Boy Scouts, like 12, 13, 14 years old, so around kind of the time that I'm having this conversation with my friends who are my neighbors. And I was also in the Scouts, having this like exploration of like identity with two of my best friends at the time in the same Boy Scout troop, who we, like the three of us, ended up all coming out to each other.
Wow.
Yeah. So I'm just now remembering like that was part of it too. So way before I even got to school, I was like, the Boy Scouts, haha, isn't gonna be like this space where like they're, you know, super pro queer kids, right? But this was happening for me. I was like building that community and camaraderie with individual people in my Boy Scout troop at the time.
Wow.
Yeah.
So you started around that time, and then undergrad, are we talking, I don't know how old you are, something like late 90s, mid 90s?
Undergrad for me was the early 2000s.
Early 2000s.
So like 2006 to 2010.
Okay. All right.
Or
So
like maybe mid to early 2000s, I guess.
okay, so mid 2000s. So what was it like to come out as gay or to start to attend gay social spaces during that time? I asked because for me, coming out in the 80s and my undergrad was pretty disastrous because there was sort of a veneer of being supportive, but really the gay community in college, sorry everybody, but you were horrible. They were just like, but in retrospect it was like, well, why wouldn't they be horrible? We had all grown up in the 80s, we had all grown up under Reagan, we had all grown up with the shadow of AIDS, we were all traumatized, we were scared to come out. Like, in retrospect, I was like, of course it made everybody was mean. So what about for you? What was the community like at that time?
Well, I appreciate you naming that experience, right? Because actually when I think about it, by the time I was in undergrad, like 18, 19 years old, I had now, because I, as I mentioned, was starting my coming out like 12, 13, 14, 15 years old, really beginning that journey for myself, that like I'd had years already of like being out to my family and friends. And so I think it's just an example of like that generational difference in experience, right? Where like I had years of building support, of building connection, of having friends, right? So like I had other friends who were queer, identified, gay, LGBT, you know, assign whichever letter you want to assign. Like I was building my own community, and like largely speaking, my parents and immediate family were really supportive. So like my like entry into that part of my life in school and like joining QSA and seeking out those experiences was just like something I was excited to do. Like it did. I definitely cannot assign any like trepidation or hesitation. I was just like ready to go. So yeah, I would say that that's something I appreciate remembering about my time in undergrad and QSA life.
How about, and if you don't, and you don't have to answer the question, but what was sexual experimentation like for you? Do you feel like partners were sensitive or responsive to CP, or did you face stigma, bullshit?
Yeah, that's a, you know, it's you know, to answer this question or to have this conversation in any other setting, let alone like here with you, it's kind of like, whoa, you know, what does it feel like to stop and think about that? And you know, I honestly feel like it was not a thing that ever came up in conversation in like my early years of like hanging out and hooking up and like seeking out those experiences. But I do definitely remember taking on the responsibility of disclosing, right? Like this like act of disclosure, like, oh, you know, FYI, here's a heads up, like this is part of my circumstance, so like I'm just letting you know. And I don't really remember outright like negative responses or reactions, but definitely like feeling self-conscious and a little bit physically awkward at first, until like you kind of just relax into the environment and, you know, you have a good time and that becomes that. But like it's just that step of disclosure at the beginning that I always was aware of, was like, this is not something that everyone else has to do all the time.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah. What kind of reactions did you receive?
Mostly folks were like, okay, that's cool. Thanks for letting me know.
Good. I'm actually really glad to hear that was some of the experience I had, because I know that there are facets of the gay community that are often very closed-minded and ignorant.
Well, you know, and then it's not to say that kind of stuff didn't happen, right? Like I definitely remember a couple situations where would have a plan to go hang out with somebody or go meet up at, you know, a bar or like go have coffee, and I would get there and they would see me and be like, oh, it's not going to work out, right? Or something came up, right? So there were definitely a couple instances where the only thing I could tie it to or think or imagine was like, okay, I am physically moving my body toward this person. There's nothing that's hiding my disability. And they're making a decision in the moment that like, nope, I'm not gonna continue with this date or moment or conversation.
How do you deal with that?
Yeah, I mean, it's hard. It sucks, you know. I think that's kind of, I mean, I mentioned to you before we started our conversation, I mentioned to you earlier that like, it is this experience of just always being in my body and always being conscious of my body as it relates to other people. So there were moments or going on dates or having coffee or whatever where I would go out of my way to make sure that I was in a seated position before the person would even arrive, or that, you know, like I would just arrange myself physically such that I could try to avoid some of that initial awkwardness for myself. And then it would be even harder sometimes because I'm like, eventually I have to get up to go to the bathroom, or, you know, so for me, it's been this experience of like this journey of trying to figure out for myself how to turn down the volume on some of that, because in some of those instances it was really overwhelming.
And so now, as an adult living in DC, what would you say your experiences are like? Do you feel like men are open? Do you feel like the community's open? Or are people still like ignorant as shit?
Yeah, I think it depends. I think it depends. I have always been super lucky and really grateful for the people and communities in my life that I can be in and navigate and just like breathe and be myself and not be super conscious. And definitely that is not always the case, right? Like, I am aware when I am moving physically in spaces, like in the before times, before COVID, when going out to bars and things, where like I could feel and see people watching me, right? In queer spaces, men like watching me, like going out of their way to like ask me if I was okay, particularly if we'd been drinking or what have you, in ways that it's unmistakable that people are, it's not like a compassionate curiosity, it's I have judgment and I'm throwing it at you.
So people are judging you for just living your life and being out and having fun?
Or like, and it feels like it's this going out of their way to be concerned for my physical well-being in a way that is like overbearing, right? Like even recently I was at a house party, and you know, I'm freshly boosted. I'm grateful for my third COVID vaccines. I'm like, okay, I'm gonna go enjoy myself at this small gathering. And I'm going up the stairs to like go get my stuff to leave. And somebody just looks at me coming up the stairs and just asks if I'm okay and if I needed help. And I'm like, I literally am just minding my business going upstairs to get my stuff. And there's no reason for you to ask me if I'm okay or if I need help. So, I mean, even as recently as a week ago, it just depends. Like I said earlier, it just really depends. And I have been in a relationship for almost 3 years now, and it was never anything that I felt like I had to go out of my way to navigate with my partner, right? Like we just are in a relationship, and he acknowledges that over time he's learned to acknowledge like the differences in the ways that we move through the world, right? Like he's a tall, big guy, like you know, is 6'5", so when he walks, he's just moving faster through the world than I am in general, right? So we'll laugh about the fact that he'll talk about like other relationships where like people, you know, former partners would just say, like, could you slow down? Like you're walking a little too fast, like you don't need to run everywhere. And he's just like, I'm just walking, right? So it's like this amusing kind of, for me, heartfelt example of like, I'm also just in my body. I'm also just moving or walking around the world, and he's doing the same. But like we have vastly different experiences of our physical bodies in the world. So I've appreciated my relationship for the opportunity it's provided to just have these reflections. Yeah.
What do you think is the most misunderstood thing you had to deal with as a gay person living with CP? What is the most misunderstood thing or the worst assumptions people make?
That's interesting. I mean, I would have to think about that question for a while.
We could also say, like, what do you want people to know? What do you want people watching this, learning, watching these TED Talks, thinking about lives, how they're creating community, creating connection in their lives? What do you want them to know?
Yeah, thanks. There are things that I take for granted, right, in my life. There, like, if you name any circumstance or context, I could probably come up with something that I take for granted. And I oftentimes wonder for myself, like, you know, people without physical disabilities, without any physical limitations, probably don't have to think twice about, like, navigating a space or going up and down a flight of stairs that may or may not have a handrail, or you know, taking up space on an elevator or an escalator when someone else might need it or could benefit from it more than you could, right? And so I think, I don't know, I would just maybe offer that we all have an opportunity to be more curious in a compassionate way, to develop, like, to deepen, to grow our empathy through compassion by, like, just even imagining, like, you know, what must it be like for someone who moves through the world in a body that's different from mine?
Yeah. I guess the other thing that I'm wondering, or that I'd like people to think about, is if someone's not living. First of all, let me ask you, is disability even an accurate word? Because I'm using this word and I'm thinking, I don't even know. Like, I'm thinking maybe physical difference, but I don't even know if that's okay. What word do you think is preferable or accurate?
I mean, this conversation around language, right, and especially in, like, movement spaces, right, and activism work is always evolving, and, like, so I feel perfectly great saying that I'm a person who lives with a disability.
Okay.
And other folks might say, like, just ask me, are you disabled, right? So, like, this whole thing about language that we use and the frameworks that we have, it's just part of this evolution that I think we're all experiencing as a community together, because it works for me, right? Like, for me, like, saying I have different abilities or I'm differently abled actually makes me feel more awkward.
Okay.
I think, you know, as I'm, like, sitting with it now, saying, oh, Daniel is differently abled, like that. I'm just like, no, I have a disability. And that doesn't necessarily mean for me that I don't think it's worth thinking about, like equity in a physical space, right? Like, a person has a disability, or is it that the world has been built up around us in a way that disadvantages certain people and makes assumptions? So, right, like, another example of this might be, you know, being in a space where folks have Spanish language interpretation or ASL interpretation, because then English is being translated or interpreted into those other languages. Whereas, like, the assumption there is that speaking English is always going to be the dominant thing that's happening in the space. What if we all had opportunities to, like, as people who hear, like, have someone interpret something that's being delivered in sign language for people who hear, right? Or have a session somewhere at some conference that is delivered in Spanish, and so for people who speak English, you have to rely on an interpreter to understand or for people who are you know, monolingual English speakers, that you have to stretch and have an opportunity to hear through an interpreter what's happening in the session. So in the same way, I think about, like, ability, right? Like, if everyone had to, like, if spaces were physically built so that everyone, regardless of their ability, could, like, navigate easily and move through the world easily, it just, in my mind, brings equity to the space.
Yeah.
Does that make sense?
I think so. Yes. Thank you.
Yeah.
I'm so glad you're clarifying these things. Okay. Let's say somebody is someone not living with a physical disability is on Grindr and they're trying to hook up and they're trying to have sex, and a potential partner says, I am living with CP. What do you want that person to know? What do you want them to make? What do you want to clarify about?
From which
So from the perspective of someone who is not living with a physical disability and might make assumptions at that moment that someone now has disclosed to them, I'm living with CP. There are some people out there who think, oh, if someone's living with CP, that they can't have sex, or that they don't have sex, or that they don't enjoy sex. What do you want them to consider? Or what do you want them to understand?
Yeah, I think this requires a certain level of self-awareness, right? So like, engage in the conversation if you're going to engage in it genuinely and meaningfully, right? Like you're not, I think we have to let go of expecting that we're gonna like open people's eyes in every interaction, right? Or help folks understand in every interaction. But I would say, as the person who doesn't live with a disability or doesn't have CP, for example, that it's your job to be mindful of your own like response and reaction, right? So like, what kind of curiosity am I having right now? How can I not like put more responsibility on this person to like support me through whatever it is, whatever reaction I'm
It's
having?
not up to the person living with person who is not living with a physical disability to put the responsibility on a person to educate them and say, it's up to you to make me feel safe.
Right, exactly.
Right.
Absolutely. And we have that conversation in many contexts now, right? Where we're building this culture together. Actually, our light's fine. Yeah.
Okay,
Yeah.
You're right. We still got light. Okay, we're gonna keep going. Okay, that was one of our lights. That was on a timer. Okay. So it's not up to the person who's living with a disability to educate, say it's okay. On the other hand, if the person has questions, and I know you're only speaking from your own experience, if someone starts asking you questions in the context of socializing or on a, electronic app, and you start getting these questions, what is that like for you? Do you appreciate them, or are you like, bitch, you just gotta do your homework, stop asking me?
Sometimes it just depends, like, and just like, can be in any given mood like anyone else. Like, sometimes I am open to the conversation, and if I'm a pretty good read on like the energy that someone's bringing, and if it is like compassionate curiosity for the sake of really trying to understand and someone else's experience, then I'm all for like having the conversation, being in that person's curiosity with them. But I will absolutely like not engage with someone who is who almost, there's like an air of hostility.
And you can tell, right? I mean, I'm sure you can tell in person. I think you can also tell in an electronic forum if someone's intentions are compassion or if they're being assholes or jerks about this. They're trying to be mean. Okay.
Yeah, that's exactly right.
I want to thank you so much because I know that this is not easy to talk about. And you have been so generous with your time, with your experience, and I know you have some trepidations, and I just want to thank you.
Yeah.
Look, I'm having these conversations so that all of us can talk about ways that we can learn how to be better friends, better partners, have fun and play and connect and really build community in a way that hasn't been done before. There's so much I don't know. The more I do these Tough Talks, the more I learn there's so much I don't know. And I don't know unless I ask questions.
Yeah.
But I do think that just the way over the last few years, in lieu of Black Lives Matter and George Floyd's lynching, there's so much that I've learned about what's happening around me that I didn't see as a white guy. I'm trying to learn more too about ableism or about the things that are happening around me that I don't see because I am not at this time living with a physical disability or physical difference. And there's so much I don't understand and, so much probably I'm not tuned into. So that's, again, that is my intention of wanting to have us talk and connect in ways that might be different from the status quo.
Absolutely.
And I want to thank you for being able and willing and vulnerable to having these conversations with me.
Thank you for helping me lean into it. I appreciate
Yes.
you, and I appreciate the time.
Is there anything else you would like to share, or any experiences or insights, or any other things that you want people to watching this to understand and learn as we go forward in this ongoing? It's not done. This is not the end of the conversation. This is just the beginning. But as we begin this conversation, what would you like people to be thinking about, considering?
I mean, I think you're right in what you just shared, which is that we have long been in a time for the conversation, all the conversations, right? But particularly now, this moment in our collective history, I think being bold and being vulnerable and being authentic, those are all things that are critical to like pushing us forward as people, as human beings in community with one another. And you're just like, this is one example of someone creating space to do that. And you know, I don't know if that just answered your question, but you know, I'm just thinking about just because we are doesn't mean we know, right? So the experiences that I've had, the identities that I hold, doesn't mean that I know everything there is to know about like being queer and living with a physical disability, being gay and living with a physical disability. I am me in my experience, and so I don't pretend to be speaking or sharing on anybody else's behalf but mine. And I pray that that more folks have opportunities to be their authentic selves and to share their story, so that we can keep doing it.
That is what my hope is as well, is that we grow, we learn, we share the stories. And I thank you. Thank you so much for doing this with me today.
Thanks, Damon. Thanks for having me.
So thank you for everybody for watching. If you like this, subscribe below to Tub Talks with Damon. If you don't like it, share it with someone you don't like, and
keep it to yourself.
Keep it to yourself. And again, what I'm getting is like really checking ourselves. I'm going to keep checking myself on my assumptions that I'm making. I'm going to ask questions, but make sure that my questions are consensual and compassionate.
Absolutely.
And I'm not perfect. I'm never going to be perfect at this, but I think this is where we start this conversation to build community and our future in a more connected, loving way.
Absolutely.
Thank you for leading the way.
Thank you, Damon.
All right, everybody. Enjoy Tub Talks. Have a great afternoon. Watch the next Tub Talk down below. Thanks.